Thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Broadband and BABA, How the NTIA's Build America, Buy America Waiver Will Impact Broadband Deployment. I'm John Whitcomb, a Managing Director at FTI Consulting, and we're excited to host you for today's discussion. For those of you who are unfamiliar with FTI, we're a business advisory firm that helps telecom service and equipment providers with a broad set of services across the business lifecycle, from diligent support in the context of a transaction to strategy development and business improvement. As you well know, the BEAD program presents a historic opportunity for individuals who do not yet have reliable and affordable internet access, as well as the businesses that will support in making this vision a reality. We're eager to support the industry in this effort, including through the facilitation of timely discussions on important program considerations such as BABA compliance. Here with me today to discuss this topic is Will Arbuckle, a policy advisor at the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Will has kindly agreed to offer formal remarks on the agency's recently published BABA waiver. Following Will's remarks and brief Q&A, my colleague Liz Rothenberger will moderate a panel discussion with industry experts from Adtran, Clearfield, Aiken Gump, who will be formally introduced later in the program. Before I turn it over to Will for his remarks and brief Q&A, I do want to review just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions for the speakers, please submit them via a Q&A function in the Zoom. We'll be monitoring submissions and we'll do our best to get through them all. Also, please note that this webinar will be recorded, so if you have colleagues who are unable to attend, feel free to forward along the recording that will be provided following the event. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Will Arbuckle. Will joined NTIA in November of 2022 as a policy advisor. He's focused on broadband supply chain issues, ensuring there are clear rules that define Made in America production requirements, as well as partnering with industry to spur domestic investment in the creation of manufacturing jobs. Prior to joining NTIA, Will spent a decade building technology companies in the Silicon Valley. He spent 5 years at Google, preceded by 5 years at Next Insurance. Will, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the intro. I now don't need to introduce myself, so thank you for that, and thanks to FTI for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to everybody that has joined. I see that we just crossed 100 people on the webinar, so go us. I am also joined by a late-breaking guest, also from the NTIA, a gentleman and colleague named Nick Alexander. So when we move to the Q&A portion of our chat, you'll have two folks at NTIA to direct your questions to. John did the setup here, but I just want to reiterate to you like what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so. So if you aren't aware, last week we announced some news where we released a proposed Buy America waiver for the BEAD program. And what I'm going to do is spend a few minutes giving you a refresher on what the Buy America preference is and how it relates to BEAD. We'll then segue to what we think are some of the highlights of the waiver. I'll share some of the specific next steps that some of you on the call can do, and then that will be about 15 minutes, and then we got 10 minutes for Q&A. So the first thing is, and maybe to the person managing the slides, you can move to the next slide or pull them up. Yep, great. You can go to the next slide. Yep, great. Just gave you the agenda. Let's go to the following slide. So we've got lawyers here, we've got manufacturers, there's state broadband offices. There looks like there's a pretty diverse array of groups here. So if you are not familiar with Build America, Buy America, or BABA, let me just give you the macro perspective here. So when Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law and President Biden signed it, they tasked NTIA with the responsibility of implementing BEAD. And on top of that, they wanted to ensure that this taxpayer money would be spent on products made by American workers, and which is why they passed the Build America, Buy America Act, which you can see on the screen here. And what this does is it sets forth and it requires that all iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in infrastructure projects funded with federal dollars, including BEAD, are produced in the U.S. So the starting point here, when we're looking at that $1.2 trillion, including the $42.5 billion allocated for BEAD, is that the vast majority of equipment, of equipment that's going to go into those deployments needs to be made in the U.S. That's the starting point. And then you have a waiver, which I'll talk about in a moment, which elucidates more clearly what needs to be made in the US and then what gets waived. If you go to the next slide, this is a really important idea right now. And you saw this in the State of the Union address that President Biden gave in February of this year, where he specifically said, and I quote, we're making sure that every community has access to affordable high-speed internet. And when we do these projects, we're going to buy American. So this is something that is front and center, and it's something that we're taking really seriously as we try to build a rule set that is going to make sure that we ensure a strong domestic supply, as well as generate as much domestic production and job creation as possible. If you're wondering, and again, before I go into the highlights, how did we even get to this point? I think I would just call out that it's easy to say, if it can be made in America, it should be made in America. And that is our broad commitment. But I think the reality here is often more complex. So to give you just a peek behind the curtain in terms of what our thinking was when we really started this in earnest late last year, there were a few questions that were top of mind. First question is, what equipment will actually go into a typical BEAD supply chain deployment? Number two, who makes this equipment? Where is this equipment made today? Number three, what are the ramifications, whether it's time, whether it's cost, whether it's commercial viability, of making any particular piece of equipment in the US? So these were the questions that were going through our mind when we started this process. And we knew that the best place to get this information would be on the ground floor with the actual companies that make this stuff, the supply chains that are making it, or the teams that are buying this equipment. And so just so that everybody on the call knows, we held nearly 250 meetings over the first 6 months of this year. And we tried to develop as much as possible a data-backed opinion of current and future supply chains. So what we've ultimately come up with, we've really tried to bake in with real-time accurate information. If you go to the next slide, I know, being somebody that was not in government and has come into government, that understanding the rule sets here can be a little bit confusing, especially if this is not part of your day job. So I wanted to highlight there are two distinct documents that really articulate and provide the details and the guidance on Buy America. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you have OMB's, the Office of Management and Budget's final guidance that was released. And this provides the standards for construction materials that are used in infrastructure projects, including BEAD. So I would encourage you, you can see this is a screenshot of the fact sheet that came out 2 weeks ago. I would encourage you to look at that and bookmark that if you haven't already. On the right-hand side here is the proposed waiver for the BEAD program that we released last week. And again, these two are complementary documents, complementary guidance that, again, is the goal is that it provides to all relevant stakeholders what the Buy America requirements are going to be. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're looking at some of the highlights here. So the first thing that I would call out for you are the Buy America requirements for glass, optical fiber, and fiber optic cable. I won't read through what you can see on the screen here in terms of the manufacturing processes, but you can see that OMB, this comes from OMB. OMB has provided final guidance on the specific steps that need to take place in the US for these three key inputs to optical fiber and fiber optic cable, which we expect will be a significant piece of equipment that is purchased for BEAD deployments. I'll note that in our proposed waiver, NTIA has proposed to waive the Buy America preference for non-optic glass inputs. So for example, an overclad cylinder, which are used as an input to the preform manufacturing process of optical fiber. So that's a little bit of a mouthful. I would encourage you to read the waiver to see this sort of in full, but I'll just highlight there is that very narrow and targeted proposed waiver that we've put forth for that particular item. So again, these are the rules, these are the domestic manufacturing steps that OMB has set forth for optical fiber and fiber optic cable. Let's move to the next slide, please. There is, or when it comes to electronics, we heard from across industry that there were some concerns about the lack of availability of electronics that would be compliant with the Buy America preference, and specifically how the integrated circuits that go into these electronics, or the chips, are almost uniformly made in Southeast Asia. So throughout our research, what we found is that there actually is an economic case for onshoring the assembly of certain electronics that historically have mostly been made overseas, not entirely, but mostly made overseas. And so what NTIA has proposed to do is waive all electronics for the BEAD program, with the exception of the 4 categories that you see in front of you here today: the OLTs, OLT line cards, optic pluggables that are installed into OLTs or equipment that acts like an OLT, and the optical network terminals here. I think there's 2 highlights that I want to call out here for this electronics category. In the waiver, you'll see that we have spelled out specific manufacturing steps that need to take place in the US in order for these electronics to be considered Buy America compliant. So I'll just say that for most of these, that first step is that printed circuit board assembly needs to take place in the US. Again, I would refer you to the waiver to see the details. The second thing is, and you can see this in the second bullet point, we heard from many stakeholders, again, I just mentioned this, that the chips are very difficult to source in the US. And I would say that while we're excited to see the results of the work that the Biden-Harris administration and the Department of Commerce is doing to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US, we have decided to waive the 55% cost of components test for electronics, knowing that the majority of the cost of components are in the chips, and the chips today are not made in sufficient supply in the US. So again, a bunch of information. I'm trying to distill this down into, like 2-minute pieces of information that people can get the main takeaway here. Again, you've heard me already say this. I would encourage you to go to the waiver if you've got follow-up questions. Let's go to the next slide. Enclosures. The headline says this: enclosures, another category of equipment that in our proposed waiver are not waived. You can see here our definition of how we're defining an enclosure. We have in the waiver provided specific instruction of the manufacturing steps that need to take place for enclosures. And similar to electronics, we have waived that 55% cost of components requirement. So that is where we stand with enclosures. The final highlight that I will give you here as it relates to the waiver is that we have another sort of category of equipment that we're calling other network equipment. These are the products that will be used in BEAD-funded infrastructure projects, things like lashing wire or mounting brackets or handholds. These will be subject to Buy America requirements, so they'll need to be made in the US. What I think is important to note is that there is the opportunity to apply the Department of Commerce's de minimis waiver to this equipment. And so there's a separate waiver coming from the Department of Commerce. It's called the de minimis, and ISPs, network providers, have the opportunity to apply that de minimis waiver against a certain amount of this other network equipment. Gives ISPs a bit of flexibility. If there are hard to source items, the feedback that we've heard generally is that most of this network equipment is already available in the US. So that's the other network equipment. I will call out that this de minimis waiver cannot be applied to the 4 electronics that we just reviewed or the enclosures. If you go to the next slide, this is a little bit of the homework for everybody on this, by the way. We have released a proposed waiver, and I emphasize it's a proposal. So it was released last week. It's available for public comment for 30 days, and it will close for comment on September 21st. I strongly encourage you, if you are somehow related to this, we look forward to receiving some sort of email or comment from you. So if you think that we got this totally right, you can let us know. If you have a question or you need a clarification, or you've got some use case that you think is not articulated in the waiver, this is your opportunity also to let us know. We're going through all of these comments, and then we will take them in, review them, make any relevant adjustments that we think are necessary, and then we will publish the final BABA waiver for the BEAD program, ideally later this year. So that is one way for you to be involved here. I think just as we wrap up, I'm looking at time here. I think I've just got maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Under this approach, we estimate that on a per project basis for the BEAD program, close to 90% of BEAD equipment spend will be on American-made products and materials. And the importance of that is that means more good jobs in the US. It means more success for our businesses in every corner of the country. And it means a stronger and more resilient supply chain. That is balanced with our analysis that also shows that these items are going to be available, and that the supply chain is going to be resilient there. We've already seen, you can go to the next slide. We've already started to see companies step up. I know that looking at the attendee list, there are some companies that are represented on this map that are part of this call, but we've seen Corning, CommScope, Prysmian on the fiber optic cable side announce investment in job creation. We've seen Adtran in Alabama, Nokia, Wisconsin announce how they'll make broadband electronics in the US. And I would say we also don't think we're done. I'm confident that there are going to be more companies that are announcing domestic investment and job creation in the US for the BEAD program. If we haven't talked, you can go to the next slide, thanks. If we haven't talked, you've got my name, you've got my glamour shot, you can see me in real life. But here's my email, here's my phone call. If you're thinking about expanding in the US, and we haven't chatted already, I encourage you to get in touch, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you to learn more about your business and how it's impacted by BEAD and the BABA program. So our goal, as I mentioned, is to build broadband networks. It's to connect everybody in the US with high-speed internet, and to have an American workforce that's helping build those projects. And that's what this Buy America waiver is intended to do. So thank you, everybody, for your time. I hope I didn't bore you. We've got a few minutes here to answer any questions. So I'll pass it back to John.
Great. Will, thank you for that. Very helpful information. Appreciate you taking the time to walk through the waiver and to add some additional context as well. Several questions coming in through the line. I'm just going to start down the list. We do have a question. Will, could you just repeat the deadline to submit comments?
September 21st.
September 21st. Great. And then another question related to the waiver. Is there any timing grace period for BABA equipment, or does this start on day one?
In the proposed waiver that we've generated, there's not a grace period doesn't come up. So I would say that once the equipment is being used in the network, it would need to be Buy America compliant as the proposed waiver, at least based on the current proposed waiver.
Great. Another question here. Has there been any change in the ability for a company to use existing inventory for building these projects?
I can jump in on that one. Hi, I'm Nick Alexander. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth. Existing inventory is eligible for use in BEAD-funded projects to the extent that it is compliant with the Build America, Buy America Act. So the analysis of whether or not a device is compliant is made at the time it is installed in the federally funded infrastructure project.
Great. Thank you for that, Nick. Very helpful. Another question that we just received. Can you provide other examples of non-optical inputs to perform rather than overclad cylinder? Happy to repeat that again. Can you provide other examples of non-optic inputs to perform other than overclad cylinder?
Yeah, to the preform. I would say that that's one of the main ones. If somebody on the call or related to this call thinks that there's other ones, you're happy for you to let us know. I think that's one of the key ones that we're aware of.
But to be clear, the definition of construction material that's relevant here is glass. And to the extent that there are non-optical glass inputs, whether it be an overclad cylinder or some other input into that freeform process, that non-optical glass would be waived.
Understood. Thank you for that. More questions are rolling in. I would just remind those of you that are dialed in, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Submit questions. We still have a few minutes to get through some additional questions that are rolling in. The next question, could aerial hardware be covered under the waiver?
Yes. The waiver doesn't distinguish between aerial, buried, doesn't matter.
Got it. Another question here, how will operators know what equipment is compliant for purposes of BABA?
So the first thing is we will be releasing more information around the reporting requirements in the future. The second piece there is that we will be also hosting a list where companies, or where an officer of a company certifies that their construction materials or their manufactured products are in fact Buy America compliant. There will be a list that we will host where the relevant stakeholders will be able to see companies that have certified Buy America compliance. It's not to say that that will be exhaustive, but that will be an avenue for manufacturers to showcase that they're Buy America compliant. Nick, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I'll just add that ultimately, to the extent that a company takes a sub-grant under the BEAD program to build out network facilities, it is that sub-grantee's obligation to demonstrate their compliance with the Build America, Buy America rules, along with all of the other requirements that are associated with that grant. So when you as a potential sub-grantee are contemplating an engagement with your supplier, one of the things that you should be discussing with them is how they propose to demonstrate that the manufactured products or construction materials that they want to sell you are going to allow you to demonstrate compliance with this requirement.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Another question, do you expect any additional guidance or waivers coming out? And is there a process in place to communicate to NTIA if there are still difficulties with the supply chain or with BABA compliance?
Yeah, so two parts, just in sort of my final thoughts during the presentation. Right now in the comment period is absolutely the right opportunity to let us know if you think that there's some sort of issue there. So that's the point of the comment period. We think we got it pretty close to right, but there might be things that we missed. So that's an opportunity for you to let us know if you think that we missed something. So that's point number one. There will then be a review process, and then the final Buy America waiver for the BEAD program will be released, and that will be the rule set that will oversee the BEAD program.
For the other piece of that, which I interpret as how will NTIA and the Department of Commerce become aware to the extent that there are other supply chain issues, the NTIA the BABA at ntia.gov email address is a great place for you to let us know to the extent that you're identifying other supply chain issues, and Will and I are not that hard to find. So we expect that industry will let us know to the extent that there are other issues that we need to be thinking about.
Very good. We'll keep the questions coming in. We have a few more minutes of Q&A with Will and Nick. Thank you again, by the way, for fielding these. Next question here, how will compliance be reported by the grantee?
So you're going to love this one, but we will be providing more information about that soon. So I would say keep your eyes peeled, but we'll be providing more specific guidance on what types of information will need to be collected in order to report the report Buy America compliance.
Great. Okay. If the BEAD funded infrastructure ties into existing infrastructure, does that existing infrastructure need to pass BABA compliance as well?
No. The only yes or no answer you're probably going to get in this area. No.
Okay. Understood. All right. Is there a requirement that construction equipment being used to construct these networks be BABA compliant? So question more on the construction equipment piece of the equation.
Also no. If you look at OMB M2211, which is the initial guidance memo, there's a pretty detailed discussion about the distinction between the construction materials, manufactured products, and iron and steel products that go into these infrastructure projects as compared to the stuff that is used to build the infrastructure projects. It is only the construction materials, iron and steel, and manufactured products that are used in these projects that are funded by federal financial assistance that are subject to the Build America, Buy America requirement.
Understood. Thank you. A couple of questions here on timing of the final waiver. So question here, the middle mile waiver took about 6 months to be finalized from the date that it was first published. Should we expect the BEAD BABA waiver to follow a similar time frame?
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
You said there wouldn't be any more no's, but I'm going to say no. So we can't give you a specific date that it'll be released, but the goal is that there is definitely not a 6 month sort of gap between when the comment period ends and the final BEAD program waiver gets released.
I will say that our timing will be a function of matters beyond our control, up to and including the volume and the nature of the comments we receive during this comment period. But yes, the goal is to be the final significantly faster than 6 months.
Thank you. Got time for 2 more questions. So if you do have a question, submit it now and we'll try to get to it here. Next question, OLTs must be made in America. Are ONTs exempt?
ONTs are not exempt. I would encourage you to look at page 7 of the BEAD waiver, where it explicitly says the 4 electronics that need to be made in the US, the manufacturing steps that need to take place, and you'll see that ONTs are included in that list.
Great. I'm not seeing any additional questions. There were a few questions that came in for those that joined late. Questions around, is this webinar being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. We will be sure to follow up with attendees with a link to the recording. So please feel free to use that as a resource or share it with your colleagues who are not able to attend. These slides, I don't believe will be published. But again, I would encourage you to take advantage of Will and his contact information. Same with Nick as well. Reach out, have conversations, and but Will, am I correct in saying that the slides will not be published?
Slides will not be published, but it sounds like your webinar will be findable, and
Yes.
presumably people will see the slides on the webinar. So you'll basically have the slides. And if you have questions, you can you've got my email in the webinar, so you can reach out directly to me.
Great. Well, Will, Nick, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining the webinar and really all the great work that you and your team are doing around BEAD and also the BABA program as well. I know that there's a lot of excitement for this program. The Q&A showed as much, a lot of good interaction. Thank you to the audience for all the great questions. We're now going to pivot to the industry panel. My colleague Liz Rothenberger is going to be hosting this panel. So Liz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Like John said, we're going to turn to the industry panel to talk about the waiver and go more in depth about what that means for companies and states as everyone moves forward with BEAD implementation. I am Liz Rothenberger with FTI Consulting, a senior director on the Tech, Media, and Telecom Public Affairs team, and I have the honor of introducing the panelists for today's discussion. Robert Conger is the Senior Vice President of Technology and Strategy at Adtran. He's been with Adtran for nearly 2 decades, starting as a senior applications engineer and holding several different roles throughout his time with the company. In his current role, Robert oversees Adtran's end-to-end fiber broadband solutions, promoting future-proof 10G fiber access solutions and in-home wireless solutions that leverage the same software tools to maximize network performance and deliver efficient end-to-end broadband services. Kevin Morgan is the Chief Marketing Officer at Clearfield. He has extensive experience in advanced communications technology, fiber optic systems, and business product marketing. Prior to joining Clearfield in 2016, Kevin began his career as a network engineer at Bell South, now AT&T, and for nearly 2 decades served in various senior marketing positions at Adtran. Finally, he has served in various industry leadership positions at the Fiber Broadband Association, including 3 times as the association's chairman of the board of directors in 2015, 2019, and 2022. Rounding out today's panel is Angela Stiles, who is a partner at the well-regarded law firm Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. After 25 years of experience specializing in the federal contracting and grants processes, supply chain issues, and federal procurement policy, Ms. Stiles is considered among the prominent government contracts and grant lawyers in the United States. She's previously served as administrator for federal procurement policy within the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, and has extensive experience in contracting matters with the Departments of Defense, Commerce, Energy, Interior, Homeland Security, Labor, and Veterans Affairs, as well as the General Services Administration. So we have lots of experience on the panel. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. Starting right at the top, for Robert and Kevin, can you both just give a brief overview of your company and the role that it plays in the larger broadband ecosystem? Robert, let's start with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that intro, Elizabeth. Yeah, so Adtran makes, manufactures equipment from the optical core to the customer prem as it relates to the waiver that, we just stepped through. It's going to cover everything, OLTs, ONTs, enclosures, all of those pieces would be relevant. So we've been a little bit unique. We've been manufacturing products for nearly 30 years in Huntsville. And so you kind of look at this and as an expansion of what we've been doing.
Great, Kevin.
Yeah, so Clearfield's a public company on the NASDAQ. We've established a market leadership position in really a strategic focus with the Tier 2 and Tier 3 U.S. Broadband, community broadband market segment. And we have a scalable platform that goes end to end for fiber management, fiber delivery, and fiber protection. Unlike Adtran, and it is called out in the waiver, our focus in our product sets, we basically have 9 different segments that include access terminals, access wall boxes, active cabinets, the drop fibers, inside plant, optical components, outside plant fiber distribution hub cabinets, outside plant pedestals, and then terminated assemblies. These are basically everything that we manufacture at our headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and also using our supply chain partners.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So sticking with the two of you, now that the BABA waiver is out, can you talk about what products of yours will be BABA compliant, as well as how you plan to communicate your compliance with industry partners and the states who are in charge of kind of handing out the funds to operators?
Yeah, I guess we'll start with Adtran. On the active electronics that Will mentioned, we cover all of those. So there's kind of the OLTs, whether that's an OLT line card or a standalone OLT, that's in our portfolio. The pluggable optics that would go in the OLT, that's also in our portfolio. The ONTs that would terminate the fiber at the customer prem, that would be a key part of our portfolio. And then even some of the enclosures for active electronics, and mainly the OLT type infrastructure, the cabinets that would house that, that's also in our portfolio. So all of those would be under the scope of this BABA waiver. I mean, as it, relates to, what we're doing, as I was kind of mentioning at the beginning, it's really onshoring, more of that. A lot of the OLTs, every OLT we've ever built has been built in the U.S. In Huntsville, Alabama. That was on the map that Will showed. All of that's already been there. So it's really just expanding the scope of what we're already doing there, and onshoring more of that into the Huntsville facility. So I guess one comment on the timeline. I mean, ultimately, I think from our perspective, we're a little bit unique in that we've had that manufacturing capability in-house for a while. So if you told us, hey, everything's got to be ready to go by the end of this year, that wouldn't be a problem. So from our standpoint, we'll be ready this year, and we'll be at scale capacity next year, long before the final rule set comes into play.
Yeah, with respect to Clearfield, I think, first of all, I want to thank the administration and the NTIA for being diligent and being transparent about the waiver and the waiver guidelines. I think it's a very important step for the industry to understand, what the guidelines mean and the impact on our production capacities and onshoring jobs, as a precursor to the $42.5 billion BEAD program. Our company headquarters, I mentioned, is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We expanded our footprint there in our production facilities back in 2015 in anticipation of a spike in demand in fiber-based products, and that's played out very, very well for us. Last year, we doubled our U.S. footprint in that area with additional warehouse space to be able to take care of our customers. Part of what we pride ourselves on is the lowest lead times in the industry for the products that we serve, we manufacture. But we also have not only headquarters production capacity, but also a network of regional partners that help us with our 9 product categories. We have a lot more to explore in terms of how we perform for the BABA compliance, but we're performing our own due diligence internally at the moment and preparing for the forecasted demand that we anticipate being driven by the BEAD program. And we're working with specific companies, service provider customers of ours who've already expressed an interest in participating in the BEAD program. So we've been having dialogue with them that are in the process of seeking BABA compliance as well as participating in the BEAD program. So we're keeping up with our customers directly. We're also keeping up with the developments of the broadband offices among the states by going to regional, state and local regional broadband conferences and just showing up around the country where we need to.
That's great. Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, we will be taking questions towards the end. So again, please use the Q&A function to submit those as we go throughout the panel. Taking a broader look a little bit, Angela, I want to switch to you. We're here talking about BABA today, but of course, with the BEAD program and just accepting federal grant money in any situation, there are a lot of other requirements and compliance issues that come along with that. Can you touch on what some of those other requirements are and where companies and states should be looking for guidance as they move forward with BEAD?
Absolutely. I mean, a huge amount of the compliance burden is being placed by NTIA on the states and territories. And so, if you're a state or territory, take a deep breath, maybe have a glass of wine tonight, so we're making our way through this process. I know that you all are working on your initial proposals, and this is one critical piece of your initial proposal. And I will point out, even though it's not explicit in the NOFO that you have to call out your BABA process, it is explicit in the initial proposal guidance. If you go to page 45, I believe it is. So as you're pulling together your processes and your procedures and your management and your monitoring of the subgrantees, there's a couple of really important things to keep in mind. Most of these companies have never been recipients of federal funds, and they have never been recipients of federal grant funds. And so the more that you can help them understand what their responsibilities are going to be and how you outline that in your process and your initial proposal to the Department of Commerce, to NTIA, I think will be really critical to this actually working well. So the private sector sub-grantees, they're using a new word for all of you in this world. It's usually sub-recipients, but the statute actually called all of you private companies sub-grantees, are going to have to comply with certain parts of 2 CFR 200 grant requirements, Appendix 2. They're going to be allowability provisions in FAR Part 31. Which are these costs allowable? Are they ones that can actually be charged up to a particular grant? What's the budget for that? What are your indirect costs? Are you charging those through? And ultimately, the states are really going to be responsible for that buildup, right? You're going to have these, what they're called deployment subgrantees. And those deployment subgrantees are going to be buying products, construction, materials, iron and steel from other entities, and they're going to be the ones that are in charge of deploying. And you're putting together the plan for how you're going to select, you state and territories, select those deployment subgrantees right now. And how you tell people and what you tell people about the requirements and the compliance requirements really should be put in that initial proposal that you're working on right now, because the more you think about that right now, the easier that kind of feed up process will be in terms of what everybody has to do to meet the requirements of the law and the regulations to make this go as well as it possibly can.
Great, thank you. Robert and Kevin, back to you. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges and/or opportunities that exist when it comes to ramping up manufacturing capabilities? What steps are your companies taking to ensure that you can meet the demand as a result of the BEAD program? Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, Clearfield's been we have a proven track record of being able to meet the explosive demand, all while delivering the right types of high quality products to our customers with the lead times I mentioned. In the last 3-year period from 2019 to 2022, we grew 219% in our revenue. So we have a strength of a modular product platform that we can expand with our production capacity. The U.S. requirements for drop fiber and fiber connectivity products really positions Clearfield, I think, in a whole new light as we explore the possibility of building up even more U.S. Based manufacturing. We remain in touch with the government officials and the industry trade associations, as I mentioned, as we look to partner on ways to meet the demand of the BEAD program.
From the Adtran side, I mean, I kind of mentioned earlier, if we go back to the electronics, we've been building all of our OLTs in Huntsville from the beginning. So there's no real material impact there. It's just more scale. The more material impact, and we actually announced an expansion of our manufacturing center there in Huntsville. So this campus, anybody that's visited, it's like a 1.2 million square feet of buildings, and of that's 300-some thousand square feet of manufacturing. Within that manufacturing, it's not just like a warehouse. This is actually assembling PCBs and doing everything and solution testing and validation all there in Huntsville. And so all the facilities in place there, it's Adtran owned and operator and has been all along. And so it's now adding a lot of ONTs. Now, us, like Adtran, like almost any other vendor in this space, these ONTs have largely been built in Southeast Asia for various cost reasons or whatever historically. And so we'll be onshoring that. And that one's more impactful just from the scale you're talking about. So every home you connect has an ONT. And so that will add more capacity, which means more manufacturing lines and more workers there to address that. And that's what that announcement was a couple of weeks ago. There's also ability to different assembly of pluggable optics that will have some impact and maybe a little extra on the cabinet enclosures. But most all of that, like I said earlier, that could be ready this year. Won't have to be. I mean, I guess the good thing on OLT is because you're using existing inventory, it is nice that the OLTs you bought today actually could be used in the future. But, a lot of that, could be ready today, but, it's really just about scaling that center to kind of grow more SKUs and just more capacity over the next 12 months as we kind of build into the ramp phase of BEAD.
Great. Angela, from your perspective, does the BABA waiver and the recently updated guidance from OMB provide the proper clarity that states and companies need? And if not, what ambiguities still exist, and how do they go about navigating those?
So as you can probably see from the first questions we had, a lot of the questions are really about the OMB final guidance and how that's going to work. What is, you have 3 categories, right? You have construction materials, you have manufactured products, and you have iron and steel, and that's everything. But it's everything that is delivered to the construction site and that will be incorporated actually into the project, permanent incorporation of the project. So in some respects, it's a limited world, right? It's a limited world of things that are covered by BABA. And, the hardest questions, and they've been the same questions for decades, is what is manufacturing? And they tried to answer those. And how do you count the cost of components? Because for manufactured goods, 55% of the cost of the components that go into that manufactured goods have to be from the United States as well, and then 50% for iron and steel. And there are some many examples actually from how the Buy American with an N Act works for when the federal government actually purchases goods and services. But there's just a lot of open questions about how this is going to work when the money goes to a state what kind of certification does that state need to ask for, right? Does the state have to get a certification from the subgrantee, and does the subgrantee have to get a certification from their suppliers, and can they rely on that? Do they have to audit their suppliers once they actually receive? Does the state have to audit them? Does the subgrantee have to audit the suppliers to make sure that they're really complying? We don't know the answers to that. And I will say a hard question about the waiver is this reporting. I think you heard NTIA say that they're going to post a list, right? They're going to post a list of companies that make certifications to NTIA about compliance with BABA, but it's not going to be an exhaustive list. And so you're going to have to both deal with how you get the certifications, but there's also a reporting requirement for foreign items that are used. So let's just take foreign electronics, right? How in the world are we actually going to have a subgrantee report to the state, get the information from their suppliers about foreign electronics that are actually being incorporated into these projects? Because they come from third-party suppliers. I mean, how are we supposed to dig into that information, and how is that supposed to be reported to the Department of Commerce? Is going to be a big compliance issue, a big reporting issue. You know, a lot of time going into, well, okay, now you say you want to know this. Like, what does that mean? Like, how deep do we have to go here, and how do you expect the process to work?
Great. Yeah, there's a lot of ambiguities out there. Kevin and Robert, same question, but from your company's perspective, are there still any big unanswered questions that the waiver doesn't address for your company specifically?
I think, to Angela's point, we'll have to work out all the reporting and stuff. I think for us, that would be relatively easily. I mean, we'll take, the responsibility as the electronics vendor. A lot of times, especially in these regional operators, they'll kind of tend to go to a vendor and say, I need you to provide everything from the access, the aggregation into the customer prem, and they're going to look to us. It's actually, I mean, most all these products will say made. You can look at it pretty easily and say it's made in the USA. With the manufacturing requirements should say that right on the outside of the products. So it should be relatively easy to look at an ONT when you get it and say that, yep, it complies or not. In that case. But look, we'll take that on and we'll register all of our products, and communicate that clearly to our customers. So there's some questions there, but I think we'll have answers to each of those. Beyond that, there's a couple questions we'll probably pose to Will through the 30-day comment period, but I think they're relatively minor in nature.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I think the waiver really does a good job to answer most of our questions. I think we do have some questions that are still we're investigating at the moment. There are a few examples. For example, one of the specific phrases in the waiver talks about seems to focus on closures that include active optics. Well, what about closures that have passive optics? There's it's a nuance, but it matters in how we apply the value add to the company. So our company, is in the business of adding value to some of these enclosure products that would include passive optics. So, there are a few of those questions, but for the most part, I believe the waiver does a really good job to provide the guidance. And I'd just like to say too that the big thing that this does for us as a supplier in the community, it levels the playing field. It brings everybody under the same set of rules. It brings everyone coming to a competitive environment with the same requirements. There's no getting around it. So we know that, all of our competitors are going to be under the same guidance. So we feel really strong that we've got a great shot to win some really good business that's long lasting as a result of that level playing field. And I think, that just comes out of the transparency that we're seeing from folks like Will and the NTIA.
Perfect. Angela, you touched on and you spoke about the ambiguities and the challenges that will pose for states, for subgrantees. What questions should the state broadband offices be asking to operators throughout that subgrantee process? And then in turn, what information should operators be prepared to provide? How can they best help each other through the process?
Yeah, I think it's a question of determining the best way to comply, right? So is a state going to ask for certifications of compliance? Are you going to require the grantees to ask for all of their suppliers to give certifications and to supply those up the chain? Is there going to be some level of auditing and monitoring required by the states to ensure that it's accurate? Maybe the auditing and monitoring isn't required for the ones that actually are listed on the NTIA website. Is NTIA going to be doing that to ensure that there's, everybody's worried about liability here. Who is liable if the certification is wrong, or if we receive a non-compliant product, and what happens? Does it have to come out? Like, if the product is not compliant, does that mean we have to replace it with a compliant product? And who pays for that? I think clarity around how all that's going to work will be really important for the states as well as the sub-grantees and the other suppliers, so that we don't end up with like 500 different certifications, right? What'll often happen is that a company will say, oh, well, I want to protect myself from liability here, so I'm just going to write my own certification for suppliers, and that'll be different. So, lower tier suppliers will receive 50 different certifications with 50 different, articulations of the language, and they'll have also posted on the NTIA website, and that just increases the cost, right? And so making sure that everybody is using a similar format and a similar requirement so that it doesn't increase the cost of actually deploying this.
And is there anything that they can be doing right now to help prepare themselves, to help set themselves up for success when it does come time for reporting? Or is that, just wait until you get there and figure it out then?
No, they're all the states and territories are drafting their initial proposals, is my understanding. And part of that drafting is the requirement to be very specific about how the award monitoring process is going to go. And so the more detail that is in there, in that initial proposal back to NTIA, that they've worked through with industry, the better, right, for everybody. And you'll have an opportunity, as this moves forward, to tweak that as necessary so that there's some, hopefully, consistency among the states on how this works.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Shifting gears just a little bit, Kevin, the BEAD program also presents challenges unrelated to the supply chain specifically. One of the biggest things is workforce. What is Clearfield doing to address the workforce challenge and ensure that there are enough certified workers to actually build out these networks?
Yeah, as a technology supplier, it's easy to get focused in on, the bits and bytes and, the connections. But when we look at the industry as a whole, there are a number of other limiting factors that are going to really constrain our growth. And you mentioned the labor supply, the skilled labor supply is one of those. One of the things that Clearfield's done recently and in the past decade is built up a knowledge base that we call Clearfield College. It's a curriculum that's designed to really help focus bringing that knowledge base up to speed with what's needed in order to understand fiber technology, in order to install the products and be certified and function better. And it's not limited just to our contractor community but we could use it internally. We do use it internally on our manufacturing floor as we bring on these new workers and things to bring them up to speed with how to use the know-how that we've developed as a company in building out these products. So I think the progress is a little difficult to measure, but we've got others in the industry that are dealing with layoffs and other types of ways. We're investing our dollars in our people that we think will make a difference, including the labor market, the contractors, the installers, the technicians that are measured on, and their key performance indicators are for how fast they're able to install it, and is it a good quality install. So that's a very, very difficult hill to climb, but we're all in on our Clearfield College.
That's great. Again, reminder, feel free to drop a question using the Q&A function. We have time for a few, so I'll turn to those now. So we got a question: how will costs be affected by BABA compliance? And anybody can feel free to answer that one.
I'll take it from the electronic supplier first. I mean, I think if you look at BEAD and it's $42.5 billion and I've served 12 million or so homes. I think the average home's over $3,000 is kind of the support levels. And so what we're talking about here is, in our case, our situation, the OLTs, there'll be no impact. We've already been building every OLT, whether you were a small U.S. rural service provider or a large European tier one, you were buying it built from our Huntsville factory. So there's no material change, no change there. There may be a small, modest change, but we're talking low, modest amount of change for them. Even if it was $20, let's say, of a $3,000 sport. So it's basically negligible, in my opinion, on ONT optics or ONTs, OLTs, OLT optics, all that stuff. It'll be a negligible impact compared to the overall cost to serve. All that cost is into the labor and everything else to build actually build the fiber networks. Kevin maybe can comment a little bit more on the passives side of things.
Yeah, certainly on the passives. As I mentioned, we've got several product categories, some of which are already BABA compliant, and we don't have to do anything to adjust the production processes there. Our supply chain already is focused on that. We do have a few categories that we're going to have to make some adjustments, and we anticipate that would have a cost impact that would be increasing, but then it becomes a business decision about how we go about competing for the business. Like I said, fortunately, the rules are all the same for everyone else. So we feel very good that it's in a fair playing field. We can compete for that business very effectively.
And I guess just expanding on that, we got a question about Clearfield's manufacturing processes for enclosures. For those 9 segments, is that all in the U.S.? Will there have to be a change? Sounds like there's some decisions coming up.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's something that we've been internally doing a lot of due diligence to look at that within our engineering and product development resources. And fortunately for us, the majority of our products are already there or have a path to be there without much change. There are a few categories that we're looking at having to make some adjustments, but we're not ready to comment more on that.
We have a question, follow up on modules. Modules basically a printed circuit board in a metal enclosure. What's special is the transmittal receival optical subassembly, which contains lasers, photodetectors, optics. Are these all going to be produced in the U.S. as well?
It's not.
I think in order to meet the requirements of BABA, you'll have to, maybe not all. There's a segment, the majority of the 55% cost, and then the last manufacturing would have to be in the U.S. So
yeah, that
absolutely occur.
And that specific one, the Trosas, Rosas, Bosas, that actually, some of those optical subassemblies would not have to be. It's actually more just the assembly of the modules and the test and validation of all the modules. For that specific one, that would fall under the electronics category, where the 55% content threshold was waived, and those optical subassemblies actually do not have to be. That's similar to the semiconductor situation, where at this moment in time, you can't move all of that overnight to the U.S. And so that's basically was not intentionally. I think Will and others could have to comment on that to be more explicit, but ultimately I think that was not explicitly not required to be here in the U.S. in this time period. But there was other value add things in terms of assembly and test that will be required in the U.S.
And I think it's important to remember from the OMB guidance, it's measured when it's delivered to the site. So whatever format you're delivering it to the site in, that needs to be manufactured in the United States. And then the 55%, cost of components is measured from what's in that's delivered to the construction site.
Yeah,
good point.
But in the case of electronics, 55% was waived, just to be clear. So that's why it was
yes,
different situation than say some of the other inputs.
So before we wrap up, really quickly, Angela, best piece of advice for state broadband offices? After all we've discussed, is there any advice aside from?
I would just say work with the entities that are going to be your sub-grantees to make this as seamless and as easy a process as possible for everybody, because it'll reduce the cost and you'll be able to get more for the money that way.
Great. Robert and Kevin, any parting advice for operators as they move forward and work with the states?
Yeah, I mean, obviously happy to reach out to us, reach out to NTIA, but you know, we've been doing this a long time, so I feel like we have a lot of experience here. But yeah, feel free to hit me. All right. Reach out to us with any questions. You can easily find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and you know, the same here. I've already been having conversations with many of our customers, and we know that there's a lot of interest in the BEAD program, which by definition requires BABA compliance. So we're here to help, and we're excited about our opportunities.
Great. Well, thanks everyone so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure we could kind of talk about this for hours. There's a lot there. Thanks again to Will and Nick for joining us, and thanks again to the panelists for a great discussion. As John noted, we will be posting this video online and circulating, so keep an eye out for that link. And if you'd like to get in touch with any of our panelists, Will, Nick, myself, John, you can certainly reach out to us on LinkedIn. I know Will had his contact information earlier in the presentation, so don't hesitate to reach out with any further questions or if you want to talk through anything. But with that, thanks everyone for tuning in and have a great day.
Thank you, Liz.